Welcome to the Maritime Matters podcast. Did you know that 98% of Australia's trade passes through the maritime domain? 91% of its fuel is imported, and Australia's exclusive economic zone is larger than its mainland. It's easy to see that to Australia, maritime matters. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we break down what the week's events mean for Australia's maritime security and the wider Indo-Pacific. Hello, welcome to Maritime Matters. My name's Richard Dunley and I'm joined by my co-host, Jennifer Parker. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we unpack the key developments that have been shaping maritime security in the Indo-Pacific and beyond, and we talk about what's been happening in the region and things around kind of capability and that sort of thing. We are recording on Monday, the 24th of November. So if something like last time, if something big happens between us recording and it managing to get out, that's the reason why we don't cover it. Hey Jen, how are things? What have you been up to?
Hey Richard, I'm good. Glad to be back for another of our non-weekly episodes of Maritime Matters. So yeah, we announced the last one literally the day I think it was like an hour after we announced it. It came out with Donald Trump's tweet about nuclear-powered submarines for South Korea. So that was bad timing. But what have I been up to? Well, I've been in Brunei doing some work with the Brunei Navy and some of their departments as part of Indo-Pacific Endeavour 25, talking maritime security. And last week, I was very excited to sit down and host a fireside chat with Admiral Lisa Franchetti, previous US CNO. And of course, you hosted her as well, Richard, for a roundtable.
We did. She very kindly agreed to come up and join us at UNSW, so it was good. Incredibly impressive.
Incredibly impressive. Absolutely. And a statistic that keeps sticking in my head that she was talking about when we were talking about recruiting is that the US Navy, just to stay on par, not to grow, just to stay on par, needs to recruit 40,000 people a year. Really puts into perspective our challenges. I've been thinking about that a lot.
Yep. Some of those numbers are just bonkers. They really
Absolutely bonkers. Speaking of bonkers numbers, the other thing I did have a piece in the Sydney Morning Herald, and you can also find it in the Strategist on my website and on the Australian Naval Institute website, talking about defence spending again. Which, if you're not in Australia, you're probably bored of Richard and I talking about this, mostly me. But if you are in Australia, then you'll be following that this is a huge challenge for the Australian Defence Force in terms of, our strategy has evolved significantly over the last 5 years, but our resourcing has not evolved significantly. So that becomes a challenge. And in the lead up to the National Defence Strategy being released most people expected April next year, but I'm not sure if that's absolutely correct. And likely a public integrated investment program, there's a lot of discussion around defence spending again.
It's the one that never stops giving, isn't it? The gift that never stops giving. I think we'll be talking about this for some time to come. But then I guess people have been talking about defence spending for as long as there have been defence forces. So we can keep on banging this drum for a while.
You can.
Anyway, what's been happening in the region? If we get into it.
So a fair bit's been happening in the region. So we are recording this. You might have said this, I can't remember, but we're recording it anyway on Monday, the 24th of November. And so there's some stuff happening at the moment. There's been a statement from the new Japanese Prime Minister to her parliament, which China has taken offence to, and responded with some more economic and also military coercion, so between Coast Guard vessels around the Senkaku Islands and things like that. We're not going to focus a lot on that today. We actually want to get around the traps in terms of some of the specific events that Australia has been involved in. So the first one we'll start with Exercise Malabar, everyone's favourite quadrilateral exercise. So Exercise Malabar has been conducted, I think it was between the 12th and the 18th of November, out of Guam, which is interesting. I feel like that might be the first one out of Guam, but I don't actually have any facts to back up that statement, so maybe it's not. But it involved HMAS Ballarat, which is an Australian Navy Anzac class frigate, also a Royal Australian Air Force P-8 Poseidon. Interestingly, it was joined by Hyuga. Did I pronounce that right?
I have no idea. That would be my take, but
Right. Well, if I didn't, somebody can tell me on YouTube how to
Absolutely.
pronounce that. But the Hyuga helicopter destroyer or light aircraft carrier, the Indian frigate Siadri, and DDG, US DDG Fitzgerald, a US sub and American P-8. So that's quite a significant force. I thought it was interesting that the Japanese sent their helicopter destroyer or light aircraft carrier to participate. So that's quite a large exercise, 6-day exercise with a lot of assets. Malabar has been around for a long time. Of course, it's been around since the early 90s as a bilateral exercise between US and India. Australia actually joined it for the first time in, I'm going to say 2007. But then there was, the then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd then pulled us out of it. There's a long story behind it. We won't get into it. We've probably touched on it before. But then Australia rejoined the exercise in the last 5 years. I think it was around 2020. Significantly in 2023, Malabar was conducted out of Australia. So this is kind of a good exercise. There is often a lot of criticism of the Quad that it doesn't focus on the security aspects, and in my view, it's never going to focus on the security aspects. But the one exception to that really is Exercise Malabar. Any comments on Exercise Malabar?
Yeah, so I thought it's interesting. I get the impression, and this might be, and you might be able to push back on this one, but I get the impression it seems to have a reasonably strong ASW kind of focus. Because it's the smaller of the two sets of Japanese helicopter destroyers, which are very much kind of ASW focused assets, and obviously the inclusion of an American submarine and the two P-8s. So it seemed to have a little bit of an ASW kind of flavour, which I thought was interesting. And again, fits in with this idea of kind of the increasing complexity and willingness to engage on very much kind of high intensity type operations. So I thought that was interesting. And then immediately following on from Malabar, Ballarat, and I'm now going to mangle the name of the Indian frigate as well, Sahandra. I've no idea.
There's no N in it. There's no N in it.
Undertook exercise Ausindex, which is a bilateral Australian-Indian exercise in the Northern Pacific. So, series of exercises being undertaken by Australian platforms, well, by Ballarat, as part of this, I guess, network of partnerships in the region. So, yeah, interesting.
It is, and Ausindex is my favourite exercise, by the way. I'm sure I've bored you with this story, but did name it. Can take credit for that very complex name of Ausindex and planned the inaugural one some 10 years ago. In fact, this is the 10-year anniversary of Ausindex. There you go.
There we go.
Anyway, some facts that you didn't need to know for your next trivia quiz.
I don't think that there's ever going to be a trivia quiz on start dates of Australian naval exercises. But if so, I think we might be in with a shot.
Well, we should have a Maritime Matters trivia quiz.
Maybe
live
a
trivia
special
quiz on YouTube. There'd be at least 3 people that tune in, which is you, me, and your mum or something like that. Anyway, probably. We should move on. What else is happening?
What else? There was an announcement of a South China Sea transit. So HMAS Brisbane, which is also on a regional presence deployment. I kind of lost track of the fact that Brisbane was still on her regional presence deployment, and Ballarat's obviously also undertaking one. So Brisbane conducted what was described in the defence statement as a routine transit through the South China Sea in accordance with international law. And the usual statements around the demonstrating kind of commitment to the region, etc. So I would have thought this must be coming towards the end of Brisbane's RPD, or if I got this muddled up.
No, I would assume they've been up there for a while. One of the things we didn't talk about in the big gap of our reporting was the maintenance period that Brisbane did in Japan, which was quite significant. and certainly the right direction to be going in. No, she has been there for a while. I thought it was interesting with this statement from Defence. One, that they made a statement to say vessel transit the South China Sea, because Australian vessels have been transiting the South China Sea for a very, very long time.
Yep.
But two, in it had a clause where it said, or a statement where it said, demonstrating the ADF's commitment and ability to maintain a near permanent presence in the region to support regional security and stability. So I think that that's an interesting message, and it really shows that shift from, I guess, the larger annual task group deployments, which I have lamented on a previous podcast, to a strategy though of trying to have continuous presence. So less ships, but the constant RPDs. And we have throughout 2025. I mean, it seems like there's been a shift there all year from the first RPD that I think started in late Jan or early Feb. So that's a clear change in strategy. Two, the messaging is interesting. I mean, when you think about the concept of deterrence, right, there's three pillars: capability, credibility, and communications, and this is clearly getting after the communications aspect to that. So that's interesting in itself, although a South China Sea transit in itself is not interesting. And I've just said the word interesting 3 times in a sentence, following on our tradition of using that word way too much in this podcast.
I guess in terms of the statement, it is, and your point around communication, it obviously is part of this strategy. I do kind of wonder whether there's a risk of sort of overplaying this, and like, okay, if you a Taiwan Straits transit or something like that's one thing. But if you feel the need to make a statement after every time you enter the South China Sea, to what degree are you almost sort of playing into the Chinese narrative that this is somewhere special, this is somewhere different? So I don't know. I'm just kind of it feels a little bit odd to me, the idea that the ADF needs to, or defence feels the need to make a statement about something that, as you say, is so routine.
It's a good point. And I had assumed, I guess when you think about these statements, right, you've got to think about who is the target audience. I mean, I assumed in my big diatribe about deterrence that the target audience was China and the PLA, but maybe it's not. Maybe the target audience is the Australian public, to show that they're doing more on defence. There certainly has been and I think one of the things that I would commend as we head to the end of 2025, I think there has been a significant effort, certainly by the Joint Headquarters here in Australia and Defence more broadly. We often critique the lack of communications, but I think that 2025 there has been an uptick in communications on what Defence is doing. And as that, I'll give a quick chuck up to another podcast that neither of us are on, but everyone should listen to if you are Australian, which is the National Security College podcast, where the Chief Defence Force, Admiral Johnson, just sat down with Rory Medcalf, and I would commend it to you if you're interested in Australian defence. But I think that has been part of a broader leaning into communication. So maybe I got the target audience wrong. Maybe the target audience for this is the Australian public. Who knows?
Coming back to the point that you made earlier about presence and the South China Sea, what else is going on?
Right. It's like we don't have a script and you don't know what's coming next. We don't have a script, actually. It's very clear we don't have a script, but we do have some agreed subjects that we're going to talk on. Otherwise, we would go for like 3 hours.
Okay, so
we do rant anyway. Let's talk about the Red Sea. You know what we did miss reporting on, by the way? That the Houthis came out in the last couple of weeks talking about the fact that they have ceased their blockade in the Red Sea. We missed it. But anyway, back to something a little bit more relevant. Not saying the Red Sea is not relevant. We won't go back to those debates. US-Philippines South China Sea Task Force was announced. So it was actually announced in October. But there has been a little bit of reporting on it recently, so we thought it was worth talking about. Initially, when this was announced on the sidelines of ASEAN, it was a little bit difficult to kind of work out what it actually is. Some of that has been clarified a little bit, but not a lot. So effectively, US and the Philippines have announced the creation of a joint task force aimed at further deterring Beijing's coercion in the South China Sea. Interestingly, there's no forces attached to this. It is headed by a 1-star and about 60 staff. One of the things that I think is, I'm trying to think of another word that's interesting. I can't, so I'm just going to use it. Is the fact that this is a model that the US has used frequently in areas like the Caribbean, areas around Africa, and also the Middle East. This standing up of a staff structure to coordinate the flow of information that doesn't necessarily have assets available to it. So it's been interesting to see them lift and shift this to Southeast Asia. I'm surprised it's only US Philippines, and I wonder if there is going to be some push in the future for this to become more than just US Philippines. Whether there's going to be a push for countries like Australia, Japan, New Zealand to join it, which has been the case with these kind of constructs in the past around the world that have been stood up by the US. I think this is also interesting, given it doesn't have any forces, it's clearly focused on access and information sharing. So really, I guess, easing the path for communication on what's happening. So that's what I'm assuming anyway. There's limited information. What have you taken away from that?
Yeah, so again, initial statement, limited information, bit more information now. I'm still not entirely sure quite what it is for and how it fits. I think that obviously it does seem to be focused on information sharing, but I also wonder whether or not there's a degree of kind of signaling and that side of things here. I don't know if there is an interest in making something more permanent and drawing in others, particularly Australia, Japan, and potentially somewhere like, I don't know, Canada's also been relatively present in the region. Then that will be a very, very different kind of a beast than what we've currently got, which obviously, given the relationship that already exists between the US and the Philippines. So I don't know. I think it's one of those ones where I think we just have to wait and see what develops, whether or not this is a more of a thing for imaging and signaling and visibility, or whether actually it is going to be something that is going to have a significant impact. I do struggle to see how much impact it is likely to have in the... I mean, it was framed around this idea of pushing back on Chinese persistent presence and regular Chinese operations. If it doesn't have any forces attached to it, how effective it's going to be at actually changing things on the water, I'm a little bit skeptical. If it is drawing in other nations and creating a more formal structure, then that's something different, and I think would be a big development. So I think it's one for a watching brief would be my take.
I do think, again, with the limited information, this is all just kind of hypothesizing. Perhaps there is some sort of benefit, though, of trying to understand the full spectrum of exactly what's happening first in the West Philippine Sea. And potentially this is actually just about fusing all of those bits of information to understand what's happening more broadly. Who knows? Anyway, speaking of US and China, what's been happening with US and China?
So we had another round of the US-China maritime security talks. These took place between the 18th and the 20th of November in Hawaii. It's part of the MMCA, and I had to go and check again what MMCA actually stands for. The Military Maritime, it's Consultative Agreement. These were originally stood up in the late 1990s. It's a framework by which basically the US and China can have an established framework of military to military talks. They were, of course, quite infamously suspended in 2022 following Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, and they were revived again last year. And I think this is the second round of them since they've been revived. There's relatively little information, obviously, about what was actually discussed. The comments were that they were frank, but constructive. So I think we can take from that what we will. The respective statements from the Chinese emphasized what they see as American interference in the region and undue surveillance, etc. And the Americans flagged their regular critiques of Chinese actions in the South China Sea and elsewhere. So both sides clearly, it's not like we're going to reach some kind of radical new agreement out of these kind of talks. But I think that the fact that talks are taking place is obviously always a good thing. And hopefully it can be a channel for continued communication, and at least some of these issues can be, both sides can understand where the other's coming from, as well as possible, even if actual agreement is I think highly unlikely.
Yeah, look, I'm a huge supporter of talks and communication. Like, whenever we have some sort of semi-crises, whether it's self-induced or otherwise, in Australia, we often find a lot of commentators saying kick out the ambassador. And there are certain times where that is appropriate. Of course, this year Australia kicked out the Iranian ambassador after the IRGCN had coordinated some attacks in Australia. So we get to the point where of course, that needs to happen. But short of that, I think that communications is always critical. So it's good to see these talks. I thought an interesting point was that I haven't been able to find this morning, and if it exists, and I'm sorry, but a statement from either Indo-PACOM or the Pentagon on this. Normally on these kind of things, you'd see a US statement out pretty quickly. So the only thing we have guiding us on the discussions is actually a Chinese statement, which I thought was interesting. Maybe not to read too much into it. The second thing, which is not interesting, but MMCA. Somebody is obsessed with the acronym of MMCA. So in this context, MMCA is the Military Maritime Consultative Agreement, but also it sounds like the acronym of MMCA, Multilateral Maritime Cooperative Activities.
Yep. That was why I had to go back and double check, because I was then like, is it activity? Is it what
acronym?
Absolutely.
Anyway,
Everyone loves
wonderful
an acronym.
Things. Your mother country is active in the region.
Yeah. Although I don't really still know what's going on. There was an announcement of a deal between Britain and Indonesia, a maritime deal worth approximately £4 billion. It seems to be led by the defence firm Babcock. When I initially saw this, I assumed it was the Babcock bid for the Indonesian frigate program. But as far as I can tell, it is not. I don't think so. It's a maritime partnership program, is seemingly what it's being called. And it's about jointly developing capability for both the Indonesian Navy, but also for their fishing fleet. So, yeah, I generally have no real idea quite what this means and what it looks like. It's being spruiked in Britain, certainly in terms of its jobs potential. Some of the capabilities are set to be built in Britain, and claims around sort of 1,000 jobs being secured, etc. And there's also interest in engaging with Indonesian shipbuilding and building up Indonesian shipbuilding, and there's obviously quite a lot of interest in kind of partnership deals between European and Southeast Asian shipbuilders. So that maybe makes sense in that kind of way. But in terms of actually what it is that's been agreed and what the £4 billion is for, I'm a little bit in the dark, to be honest with you. But it sounds interesting. To use our word, our favourite word.
To use our word. Somebody should do a thing where they take a shot every time that we say the word interesting. Yeah. So I guess, if you read the UK statement, it talks about it's led by the British defence firm Babcock. It will see the UK and Indonesia jointly develop maritime capability for Indonesia's navy and more than 1,000 vessels for its fishing fleets to boost seafood consumption and in turn food security. Little odd. Not sure what the support is to the Navy. I mean, when I saw Babcock, I assumed that Indonesia was talking about the Type 31, but Indonesia's been talking about all sorts of naval vessels. It's hard to kind of keep up with it. But yeah, so anyway, but it was a big thing over the weekend in terms of this UK announcement. It seemed to be pushed more by the UK, so most of the references refer to the UK government statement on it and comments from Keir Starmer, as opposed to anything from Indonesia. But yeah, I guess they're working together on something that costs £4 billion.
But like fishing vessels, why would you build fishing vessels for Indonesia in the UK? I am so confused.
I'm confused too, and I do wonder sometimes. I wonder whether the UK really wanted to have some sort of defence statement on a relationship with Indonesia and couldn't get it over the line, so this was the compromise deal, which talks about fishing vessels. Who knows?
Maybe.
Who knows?
Anyway,
right.
we ought to.
Speaking of confusing deals, there's another confusing deal.
There is another very, very confusing deal. This is actually, it's a little bit old news in some ways because it was announced the day we recorded the previous podcast, immediately after we had recorded it. And this, of course, is the South Korean nuclear submarine deal. Do you want to talk through what we know / what we don't know about this particular one?
Well, I mean, there's more that we don't know than what we know. And I keep getting all these calls from journalists saying, can we talk about the South Korean nuclear submarine deal? And I'm like, yeah, I can talk about what I don't know. So I guess, so I can't remember when we recorded our last podcast. It wasn't 6 months ago. So I guess this was announced about a month ago, right?
Yeah.
3 weeks ago. Anyway, so for those that have been following this, and I know, in fact, when we launched our last podcast, people were like, oh, yes, the South Korean sub deal has brought you out of hiding. And I thought, no, you're going to be really disappointed because we recorded it an hour before that was announced. But it was announced initially on President Trump's, he doesn't use Twitter, whatever it is, social media
Truth
that he
Social.
Uses. What's it called?
Truth Social.
Oh, there you go. I'm not up with the cool kids. But anyway, on Truth Social, it said that they're going to work together on building nuclear-powered submarines for South Korea in Philadelphia, which everyone raised their eyebrows at because there is not a nuclear-powered submarine shipyard in Philadelphia. And that was kind of all the details. And then people went bananas in terms of what does this mean? Now, of course, a nuclear-powered submarines has been an aspiration for South Korea for a very long time. There's lots of stories about the fact that they've had designs for their own reactors, etc., etc., etc. So this came out. A week ago now, there was a fact sheet released by the US government. It was called the Fact Sheet on the United States and Korea Agree to Korea Strategic Trade and Investment Deal, which had a little bit more information, but not a substantial amount of information. And clearly, this seems to be in response to the tariffs conversation, which we won't get into that whole thing that is very much outside of our area. But in response to the tariffs conversation, there's been a meeting between the US and Korea. As part of that, Korea's agreed to invest in the US. Some of that is in shipyards, which we knew that Korea was seeking to do anyway. Of course, in the background, there's the whole Hanwha Austal conversation in Australia that we will park, but it is still bubbling away. And then in response, we just see this announcement on Truth Social that the quid pro quo for the US is that they will support Korea in acquiring nuclear-powered submarines. Now, since then, we have also seen Admiral Caudle, so the US Chief of Naval Operations, visit South Korea and Japan. There was a huge focus on the shipbuilding during the South Korea aspect. He's also spoken about this deal, although his comments are a little bit more tempering in terms of I'm paraphrasing, but this is not about to happen tomorrow. In that conversation as well, there was a lot of conversation that actually this is more likely to be built in Korea. So I guess it's easier to outline what we don't know than what we do know. We don't know what the design of the submarine is going to be. We don't know who's designing the reactor. We do know that certainly the enriched uranium is what the US is going to help on. There has been some comments about that. We don't have a time frame for this capability. We don't know where it's being built whatsoever. And I guess the final comment I would make, and look, I'm not in the South Korean Navy, so I'm happy for someone more knowledgeable to debate this point with me. But I actually am not sure why nuclear-powered submarines at their expense is actually going to aid in South Korea's challenges. Now, of course, we saw the rumours early this year that North Korea have been putting out that they are working on a nuclear-powered submarine. Of course, you always need to be skeptical with announcements from the North Korean Navy. So yes, in response to that, but if you actually look at the missions and tasks that South Korea would need to undertake, it's just not clear to me why this would be a worthwhile endeavour. What's your take on what we don't know about the South Korean subs deal?
Yeah, so I found this baffling from the get-go. I mean, all the stuff around it being built in the US never made any sense to me at all. And I think that particularly all the chat in Australia about how it was going to detract all the attention away from AUKUS was also rather amusing. But we'll park that one. I think that in terms of what is going to happen, I think there's a huge amount of uncertainty still. In terms of why does Korea want these things, I've seen a number of different arguments, and I've spoken to a few people who are much more plugged into Korean defense and Korean politics than I am. And I think that there are a couple of things that have been flagged, one of which is that there's a lot going on here behind the scenes in terms of inter-service rivalries and other sorts of challenges, and the politics behind that. Because from our perspective, it's quite surprising that a left-wing, relatively liberal government is pushing hard on an SSN type approach. The other thing, which again, coming back to your point, is that as an SSN, it doesn't seem to make a huge amount of sense, certainly not in terms of what we know about where the ROK Navy operates its submarines, etc. But the one area where it does perhaps make some more sense is in the increasing kind of hybridization of South Korean submarines with very large VLS and sort of ballistic missile type capability. So if you are viewing this as more of a step towards something that looks a bit like an SSBN, I can see a lot more potential interest. Now, that is pure speculation, but we certainly know that the South Koreans are building conventional submarines with these kind of weapons on board. And it is one of the areas where obviously you get a lot more bang for your buck in terms of going with a nuclear power plant.
Yeah, and I guess one of the things that was said to me by a South Korean academic last year, actually, when they were doing a tour talking about AUKUS and trying to understand how AUKUS happened, was that there is ongoing conversations in South Korea about nuclear weapons. And some saw this as a way to placate that conversation by saying we're getting nuclear-powered submarines instead. Now, they are not comparable, but for those who really don't understand the defense conversation, and a lot of this push about nuclear weapons is actually from the South Korean public, it is easy to say, okay, well, we're not going down that path, but we're going down this path. And so I don't know if that plays into as well, but that was something that was mentioned to me by a South Korean academic as well, but a very expensive way to try and placate the South Korean public.
Yes.
The other thing that it has prompted, and this was absolutely inevitable,
predictable as night follows day, right?
Was conversations around whether Japan may go down the same path. And so we've seen a statement from Japan's new defense minister. I'll give it a crack. Shinjiro Koizumi. I think I pronounced that okay. Let me know if I didn't. Who has called publicly for Tokyo to consider acquiring nuclear-powered submarines. I think that is, look, I wouldn't use the term unlikely because I did famously use the term unlikely about 3 months before we announced AUKUS for Australia getting nuclear-powered submarines. Thankfully not publicly, but now I've declared it. But I think that it was inevitable Japan would push that. Again, I'm not sure. I mean, Japan's probably got more of a case for it than South Korea, but I'm not sure this is, well, not probably, definitely has more of a case for it than South Korea, but I'm still not sure it's a useful investment for that country, given other capabilities they could be acquiring. But this becomes part of the broader conversation. Now, I know that you mentioned before your skepticism about impacts on AUKUS. I'm in two minds about this. On AUKUS, in terms of AUKUS Pillar 1, optimal pathway, limit impact, we're talking about completely different things. But where I do think that there may well be an issue with respect to AUKUS, and again, I think I gave an interview last week where I said, I'm not willing to commit to this statement, but it is a possibility in the future once we know more information, is that there is a question about the capacity of the US and the US Navy to support multiple countries going down this path in concurrent timeframes. Now, we don't know the timeframe for South Korea. We don't even know what they're talking about. So it may not be an issue. But there was a quote that a lot of newspapers have used from Lloyd Austin, the previous US Defense Secretary, saying that the US wouldn't have capacity to support this transfer of technology to multiple countries at once. So I think that there is a potential there, depending on what is agreed and how this progresses, if anything ever comes out of it, that there is, I guess, US Navy areas that are being pulled in multiple directions, which could have an impact on AUKUS timelines, which are quite fast. Everybody's like, oh, AUKUS, it's 8 subs in 2040 to $368 billion. Well, actually, it's quite an ambitious timeline when you look at Submarine Rotation Force West, when you look at all the training to stand up for 2032, the first Virginia sub for Australia. So I think that there could be some pressure there. But I'm saying this with lots of woolly politician words because I'm not willing to commit to it until I know more information.
Yeah, my sense is, and this is only a sense, is that what is being discussed in terms of particularly the South Korean option is so far removed from this is not it's not going to be an American platform. It's almost certainly not going to be built in the United States. It's almost certainly not going to be an American design or anything of that sort. I find it highly unlikely that it would be an American reactor in any kind of form. It would seem like, given how reticent the Americans have been to share lots of information with countries, the idea of giving one of the so-called crown jewels away seems highly unlikely to me. So I would assume it would be a much more light touch kind of engagement. The other thing which I have seen mentioned and which I think is an interesting idea, and I don't know enough about it to really unpick it, but is this idea of whether or not there is now increasingly scope for very small reactors being used as almost auxiliary power plants within more conventional style submarines. So one of the things that has been picked up in the Japanese discussion is they're talking about kind of next generation propulsion systems. And so if you think about something like an air independent propulsion SSK, what's the next step to make it more kind of much longer endurance? Well, is there a scope for a very small type reactor to not do something that is SSN style, but actually provide you with I guess something that's in between? And so I think that, again, so many questions here, but that is something where I think there's obviously potential, particularly because certainly for someone like South Korea, it doesn't seem that they want the things that you get from a traditional SSK in terms of like really long endurance, but also range and speed. They aren't things that seem particularly like that they should be an obvious priority. You're not talking a fully oceanic kind of navy, so transit speed, etc., is less of an issue. Anyway, thoughts, thought bubbles, but very interesting.
But good one, and interesting ones, right? Because I mean, we honestly don't know, and it's almost certainly not going to be what was announced on Truth Social. So
if you can guarantee one thing, it'll be that, right?
Yes. Speaking of nuclear powered submarines, I do want to flag with AUKUS 2 points. One, we did hear Pat Conroy, so the Defence Industry Minister in Australia, gave an interview last week where he talked about the fact that he was expecting the outcomes of the US AUKUS review soon, which makes sense. They did say, I mean, originally the leaked reporting was a 30-day review. That clearly wasn't true, or maybe it was true and it changed. But I think we did see something from Colby expecting that it was going to come out in November or something like that. it is obviously November. Also waiting on, the US National Defense Strategy, which is meant to be coming out very soon. So it would make sense that they come out at a similar time frame. So we should see that drop. The second element worth mentioning for AUKUS is that there was, I guess, another development in terms of the preparation for Submarine Rotation Force West in 2027. So USS Vermont, Virginia-class submarine, was in or is in HMAS Sterling, undertook a maintenance period. Some 160 maintenance tasks were undertaken, including a world first mobile pure water plant designed by Western Australia company. So that is actually very exciting, but it sounds really boring. But I mean, it's good to see Australian capabilities, Australian industry now supporting what is going on to these submarines. So I think that is an important milestone. Interestingly, the submarine, when it came in, actually had 13 Australians on it. So about 10% of its crew was Australian. So that's interesting as well. And I guess we're just seeing AUKUS ticking along. Now, I'm not trying to underestimate the challenges with it, but I mean, we are seeing continual progress towards these key milestones in 2027. So that is interesting in itself. Any comments on AUKUS?
No, kicking goals in the West. Anyway, moving on, because we are short on time. Other kind of capabilities. We've talked about it before as having the coolest name of pretty much anything around. Dragonfire, which is the UK's directed energy weapon system. A new contract has been signed to push the weapon forward and actually install it on one of the Type 45 air warfare destroyers, or Daring class destroyers. And there's been some further kind of discussion and comment around this. I thought it was interesting how it's being framed slightly differently to how I've seen it being talked about before, particularly in terms of this idea of it slotting in between your kind of missile envelope, which is providing your kind of broader air warfare protection, and then your close-in weapon systems, and this offers something in between. And it's also being much more directly now focused on discussion around drones. So whereas previously it was talking about most of the, or from memory, but there was quite a lot of discussion around more broadly anti-air type defense. It's really being narrowed down to talk about drones, which I'm assuming is around where the capability is at the moment. Now, I think that there's obviously very clear value in this in terms of a weapon system to be targeting drones, particularly in terms of the regular discussions around the kind of the economic transaction rates of you fire $1 million missile against a $200 drone, etc., etc. So there's clear value there, but I think it also probably gives a bit of an indication also about where the technology's at and where it's not at, that this is not yet going to be offering you defenses against kind of faster moving or harder to hit type targets. So I thought that was quite interesting. Thoughts?
Yeah, no, look, I think this is a positive development. I was a little bit skeptical. I saw a number of people saying, we should get this and bolt it onto our ships, the Royal Australian Navy. This is unlikely to be a simple bolt-on capability because of the amount of power that would need to be generated to support this weapon system. And for anyone that's ever dealt with ship maintenance periods and installing new weapon systems would understand that power generation is a huge problem for new weapon systems or new sensors on ships. So I would be skeptical at that comment, but I think it's something that certainly all navies should be investigating. I think to your point, yes, it fits into part of the broader defense systems on a ship. It's not a solution in itself, and we always talk about, with ships, it is really about the layered defense system, as opposed to one silver bullet or silver laser in this question. So I think that it's good development. Ambitious timeline, 2027. for it to be installed on the first Type 45. We have heard that timeline before pushed out by the Royal Navy, so I guess that's getting closer. They're still sticking to that, so it seems they're fairly confident that they will be able to install that, which is positive. Now, we probably do need to wrap up here. Is there anything else we haven't touched on that you were keen to cover?
Only very quickly, the Singaporeans have cut steel on the first of their new MCM, so mine countermeasure uncrewed surface vehicles. This is a similar design to their current maritime security uncrewed surface vehicle. And I guess it fits into what we were talking about maybe last podcast or the podcast before about the Singaporean development of their mothership concept. And so I think it's the main point here is that the Singaporeans are really pushing and doing some very interesting things. And again, one of those questions where I think it's always worth seeing how it works. Obviously, MCM is an area where a lot of navies are pushing pretty hard in terms of uncrewed systems. But there's been some quiet comments from people, particularly in the MCM community, remaining slightly skeptical about how wonderful and autonomous and fully independent all of these systems are. So it'll be interesting to see how it goes and whether or not they manage to get this capability to achieve all that they're looking for.
Yeah, so I thought this was actually I'm trying to think of another word for interesting, but I can't. So I was going to say it. Interesting. So they talk about having the first ones in the water by 2027. Most of, and I don't spend a lot of time thinking about mine warfare. I should probably spend some more time thinking about it. It is a huge challenge for many navies, including the Royal Australian Navy. And we've talked about this before in terms of platforms issue. I thought what was different here is often when I see uncrewed solutions for mine warfare, of course, which have existed for a long time, right? Like AUVs in mine warfare has been a thing for a very long time. It is not new, but they are normally focused on the identification and the neutralization aspects of the role, whereas this USV is also focused on the broader scale detection. So it actually has a towed synthetic aperture sonar for seabed survey. Which I thought was interesting and different to some of the things that I had seen before in this space. So I guess we'll see how that develops. There's also a question of how many of these, because it's quite small. It looks like it's going to be similar to their maritime security one that they say is operational in the Singapore Strait. So it'd be interesting to see what kind of scale they're talking about for this as well, because if it's quite small, then you would need a significant number of them, I suspect, to be able to clear any area in any appropriate time frame. But yes, I think it's one that Australia should be watching closely. When I talked about defence spending earlier in the podcast, one of the things I highlight, which is an easy giveaway on why we have challenges in the defence force structure that's impacted by defence spending is, one of the programs that was cancelled in the publicly available integrated investment program last year was the Future Mine Warfare Vessel. And there seems to be no solution for that, and it's a big problem. So maybe this is a path for us to look at. But Richard, we do need to wrap it up.
We do.
It has been great to chat. We don't have a Did You Know, mainly because I've been lazy, but we'll say it's because of time.
Excellent. Always good to chat, Jen.
Awesome. Have a great day.
Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.